I think we can begin. Ladies and gentlemen, and above all, the organizers of the Economic Forum, my congratulations for having put together a remarkable event, not just organizationally, but I think in the most timely fashion, able to bring together throughout the day some amazing people who've given us huge insights, intellectual, moral, clear insights into what the real challenges are facing not just us in this room, because it is your future that is at stake in what is being played out in Ukraine. And we of the slightly older generation, if I can put it that way, do feel responsible for giving our thoughts, our insights, and our advice into how this may play out. So this panel, and as the organizers, once again, my congratulations to the organizers, mentioned, it's very difficult actually to moderate this panel because so many wise words have been said and so many answers have been given. But I think it's an opportunity of those who are on the podium and with Ambassador Fried joining us to give us a sort of a final rounded picture. And it's remarkable. It's a remarkable coincidence. Today is the 12th of March. And 23 years ago, in Independence, Missouri, in the library, the Truman Library, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary joined NATO. Exactly 23 years ago today. One of the, I think it was Timothy Garton-Ash, who mentioned in his remarks the comments of Bronisław Geremek, the late Polish foreign minister at the time, who was at Missouri, at Independence, Missouri, at that ceremony. And I took the trouble to find his speech, which he spoke at that remarkable and moving event. And amongst other things, Bronisław Geremek said as follows: today's ceremony, speaking of that moment in the Truman Library, confirms that the alliance is a community of values. The success of NATO over the last 50 years, said Professor Geremek, has been built on the principles of democracy, civil rights, and liberties, shared by all of its members. The nations who join this community today were denied these values until 1989. On the streets of Budapest in 1956, Prague in 68, and Gdansk in 70 and 81, they paid a heavy price. They have proved their democratic credentials, which give them the right to be here today. And he went on to talk about the need that at the core of NATO was also the vision of a Europe not just whole and free, but open to other democratic nations who might want to join in the future. And those words at the time were applauded by all who were in that room and who were watching and reading those words. So it brings us to today and the war in Ukraine, which has brought, as we've heard today, terror, suffering, but above all, a challenge to those values. And in the original title of this panel, there was a talk of Europe on the verge of conflict. And we've heard today, I think, and all of us accept that this is a European war, But Dan, perhaps I could ask you, because this is the first time we've had the opportunity to have an American voice in the room, as it were. From the US perspective, do those values that were present in that room in Missouri 23 years ago, are they still the values that NATO is truly united under? And if so, what could we offer Ukraine as NATO, both today and in the future, opening the door to them perhaps? Is that still an ultimate goal that will bring peace back to Europe, as was hoped for by Professor Geremek and others 23 years ago?
Marek, it's good to see you, if only virtually. I was also at Independence, Missouri that day. I remember Professor Garemek's remarks. I can answer in two ways. One is the easy part. The Biden administration, at least, is committed to those values. We couldn't, thank God we enlarged NATO when we did. And I have no patience for those who argue that NATO enlargement was a provocation and it's all our fault. If we had not brought in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic into NATO 23 years ago, and the Baltics several years after that, they would today be in the position the Ukrainians find themselves. We did not succeed in bringing Ukraine in, and the reasons for this are complicated, but part of it is that the Ukrainian aspiration to Europeanize itself, to find its future in the West, had not crystallized in the 1990s. It did so only later after the Orange and Revolution of Dignity. When the window was most open, Ukraine was not ready. And now the difficulties are enormous. But this gets, Marek, to your question, and I don't want to answer it in grand principled terms only. Much depends on the way the acute phase of Putin's war against Ukraine ends. And it can end in several ways. We don't know. I don't know the outcome. Neither does the Biden administration. His effort to overrun Ukraine has failed. He now wants to pulverize the cities and beat the country into submission. But what is it he will seek? His original aims were so-called denazification and demilitarization, meaning roughly that Ukraine is under Kremlin control and open to Kremlin reinvasion. Ukrainians will not accept that, and Putin may not be able to achieve it. Will he settle for something less? Will he settle for grabbing territories, the ones he already has occupied since 2014, or additional ones? If so, what happens with the rest of Ukraine? Does it become West Ukraine, like West Germany? And I use that deliberately. Putin will insist on its neutrality, even the neutrality of unoccupied Ukraine. He will insist also as a condition for peace that we lift our sanctions. These are the problems the United States and Europe may face and will face in a very compressed time frame. Right now, it's not an issue because Putin is still arguably demanding his maximum objectives, which the Ukrainians will not accept. Might they accept something else? And the analogy I have in mind is the Winter War. The Finns gave Stalin's army a bloody nose. They forced Stalin to put aside his initial objective of communizing Finland. In the end, Stalin smashed them. They were forced to sue for peace. They lost territory, including a major city of Terioki, but they saved their country. All of us know how proud the Finns are of that strategic victory. And it was a strategic victory because we don't have to talk about post-communist or post-Soviet Finland. But it's not for us to tell the Ukrainians what to do. Right now, our objective is to help them keep fighting, to move weapons to Ukraine. The issue of Polish MiGs has been overwrought and, let us say, an operational mess up, but not through malice, through the pressures of wartime pace of decision making. We need to provide the Ukrainians with the weapons so they can continue the fight. We need to keep pressing the Russians. With those decisions, and to answer your question as plainly as I can, it may be, and one of the choices the Americans might have to face very soon, is whether to extend to an unoccupied free Ukraine, West Ukraine, as it were, more security than we were able to offer all of Ukraine up till now. Now, these sorts of thoughts are the ones that the Biden administration may face, especially if, as is possible, the Ukrainian government tells them, yes, we are willing to accept a bitter, evil territorial concession to Putin, but only if you will guarantee the security of the rest of Ukraine, and we're not interested in a Budapest Memorandum 2.0. I mention this in stark terms because the Biden administration, I believe, is aware that these issues may come up. Similarly, Putin will demand sanctions relief as part of a peace agreement. Toria Nuland, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and one of the few people in the US foreign policy community arguably more hawkish than I am on Putin, recently gave an interview to TASS in which she said that regime change was not the objective of the sanctions. The sanctions could be removed if the Russians got out of Ukraine and paid for its reconstruction. Those were among her conditions. We don't know the way this will play out or whether Putin is simply not interested in any negotiated solution at all, but wants to pound the Ukrainians, kill enough of them so that he can achieve his maximalist objectives. We are deep in that problem right now. The Ukrainians are fighting on. I don't know whether victory is more or less assured, and it is only for the Russians, and it is only a question of time and how many civilian casualties there'll be, or whether, in fact, the Russian offensive could actually fail. There is the Finnish War analogy, the Winter War analogy. There is also the analogy of 1905. That is a military failure followed by a national revolt. I don't believe that is likely. The Russians, at least at this point, seem to be rallying around Putin, so I am not predicting that. But it is possible that Putin's victory is not inevitable. In any event, we need to do the needful. This conversation has also, in the parts I was able to listen to earlier today, illustrated the longer-term challenge of what our relations with Putin's Russia will be when the acute phase of this conflict is over, but maybe Ukrainian resistance continues, which in fact is likely. Putin seems intent, this is my last thought, Mark, and I'm sorry for going on so long. Putin has already driven Russia into Soviet levels of political repression. Now he is driving it into Soviet levels of economic control. He is essentially reintroducing the non-convertibility of the ruble, and no Pole in this audience needs to hear from an American what that means. It means a black market for dollars and the things that dollars can buy. It means Putin's nomenclatura will have access to dollars and ordinary people will not. Putin said, I think it was yesterday, that the Soviet Union always dealt with the condition of sanctions and succeeded. Really? How's the Soviet Union doing today? Thomas Ilves doesn't like psychoanalyzing the Russians, but I will say this: Putin seems intent on restoring the Soviet Union and the Cold War, so perhaps in his mind, the outcome this time can be different. It won't be. In the end, Putinism will not succeed, but while it fails, hundreds of thousands of innocents may die. That's where we are. And thank you for the invitation and for giving me the chance to speak.
Dan, well, thank you for that magnificent overview. And you've touched on a lot of the stuff that I was actually hoping this panel would be reflecting on. Thank you for setting the stage so well. And I'd like to roll us back just a little bit to where we are today and pose a question primarily to Vladislav. We were fortunate we have a huge crowd here right now. In the morning when you spoke, that very moving address. There were rather fewer people here, so I want to give you an opportunity to say what needs to be done in your view now, because as we following what's going on, we're seeing magnificent resistance, of course, by the Ukrainians, not just by the military, but ordinary people, literally men, women, and even children taking arms to resist the Russian invasion. But nonetheless, slowly but surely, Russian troops are advancing, albeit at snail's pace, albeit facing temporary setbacks. We hear talk of regrouping. We hear talk of new troops being brought in, fresh troops from the east. We hear talk about mercenaries being drafted in from all corners, the Wagner Group, assassins, saboteurs. Slowly but surely, the progress of the Russians continues. In your view, what needs to be done now, in addition to what is already being done, to try and at least stop that slow but sure Russian stranglehold on your country?
It's pretty difficult to argue with Dan, who's one of the greatest minds on these issues. But before thinking what to be done, let's really try to quickly understand where we are, and what Putin wants, and this is what Dan also was saying. Clearly, we may speak about several scenarios which are on the table, or which have been on the table. The initial scenario of Putin was a blitzkrieg, so to enter Ukraine, to bomb the towns, and later in 48 hours to take over Kyiv, pushing the government to get out from the country, and therefore to declare the victory very fast, expecting that people will not much resist. And as we know, this blitzkrieg became blitzfail, because the Russian troops didn't manage to take over the airport Gostomel. The airport has been destroyed, and therefore the Russian special forces didn't arrive to this stage where they could go like a direct line to 15 kilometers to center of Kyiv. So therefore, most probably we can say that the blitzkrieg scenario currently is not working, even though 17 days is still a pretty short period of time, and he still has some time to advance, as you said. So the second is what Dan said, what you said also, is a successful resistance. So Ukraine is doing now, and I was showing you today some video. So we do some resistance, and I think it's not bad. I think it's a surprise for many people. But Putin did clearly a mistake starting bombing the towns. Instead of being afraid, people became outrageously united and therefore really ready to sacrifice their lives, which is pretty in the DNA of Ukraine. So we are ready to fight for our freedom, and freedom is a major value in Ukraine, and therefore we are ready to fight. The problem is the fighting is a process, and the question what it can lead to, and what I see, and again, don't take me wrongly, I'm clearly not criticizing, I'm really admiring the citizens of my people who are fighting, but I just want to say what should be done. So when we speak about fighting, and Putin is clearly not so much advancing as he wants, he can go to much worse things. He can try to implement something like a scenario like Syria, therefore destroying the cities, destroying the towns, and this is actually what he is doing now. There are several cities around Kyiv, but not only, like Bucha, Borodyanka, Irpin, they are almost destroyed to the ground. And the people are evacuated, and the roads are completely ruined, the bridges are completely ruined, and this will be decades probably of the further restorations. So if this kind of war will continue months or years, the Syria scenario is very, very probable. But he may also say, I don't have years, I want to do faster. And here, many of you, and we discussed also yesterday this issue, I think, of the tactical nuclear weapon, and I said it's marketing, there is no tactical, it's still nuclear weapon, and which can make big territories I mean, unlivable. And as we're saying on lunch, you know, this is only 50,000 people can die after the attack. As you understand, this is absolutely unacceptable, and the nuclear war can become, you know, a tragedy not only for Ukraine. And here, I would slightly even disagree that this is a European war, because it goes from European to much bigger. And factually, the risk of this longer-term resistance is a third world war. So there are a few other scenarios from this, but I mean, fighting itself, I mean, is not bringing us to any positive outcome. For sure, what West now is doing, you know, imposing sanctions every single day and increasing these sanctions, I think this is correctly done, and you need to do much more, including the tracking the Russian oil, not allowing Russian oil to be sold, therefore not to get any revenues, and therefore, I mean, this is what Putin brings his economy substantially down, you know, to the early 90s. And this, I think, is the right way. The question is how much resilience he may have. Apparently, his economy shows that he is not so much resilient. Look at his sovereign spreads, which are now much higher than Ukrainian ones, which means that the markets estimate the probability of the default of Russia bigger than default of Ukraine. And therefore, I think the life of regular, ordinary Russian people will become more miserable. I mean, now all international companies are leaving, the consumer companies are leaving, so they will see it. They don't see it yet. And this is, I mean, coming back to the then concept, I mean, about the Russian, you know, involvement, if they go to streets or not. I mean, probably now they are not ready to go to the streets, because even those companies which are leaving, they're clearly paying some salaries to these people. They even didn't leave yet. They are leaving on the way of leave. So they will pay for a few months, and in a few months, there will be a pretty difficult situation. And I mean, the question is that we will fight this few months, and we can again go back to the issue of the Syrian scenario. So what are the options? Do we have a diplomacy on the table? I believe so. You know, and clearly the potentially Russian coup somehow, that people will look at the probability of the nuclear war is increasing, and therefore some people in Russia can say, okay, it's too much. This, I think, is an option. But summing up, we need to have more sanctions to Russia, therefore, so from one side, increasing substantially the cost of Russian war. I agree with them that we need to supply the weapons to Ukraine in order to increase our resilience, and therefore also from our side increasing the cost of the Russian war. You know, making life of ordinary Russian even more difficult. Therefore, pushing them to think. How comes? Yes, their TV does not show, they don't have social media already, they will not have Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, etc. But they should ask themselves, you know, why is this? And maybe this is a time to go to the streets. But in the meantime, as we said yesterday, and I said it today, is clearly a very important thing is to support the refugees, because we already have 2.5 million people, and even Warsaw itself already said, the mayor of Warsaw said that it's already very hard to accept new refugees, and therefore we need to, I mean, to develop the plans of moving, you know, the refugees closer to the center of the country, also to the other countries. There should be more efforts on the European Union level, and we need to work on this on 2.5 million. We clearly need to help not only with a military, but also with a humanitarian aid to those cities, to those people who stay in Ukraine. And this is, again, your help is very much needed on that. But we need to have much more creative sanctions when they're not so much imposed by the state, but the companies are themselves looking at Russia as a toxic market. They stop relations, and therefore, I mean, cutting off the clouds, you know, cutting off all the potential IT solutions, support of IT companies, you know, I mean, they go really. And this is what was said about demilitarization, denazification. You know, this is actually what will happen finally in Russia one day, you know, and we will see that. And this is what we still need to continue doing that.
Well, thank you. And I want to actually take those thoughts a little bit further. And perhaps I'd ask President Ilves in the first instance to answer the next point, but also perhaps I'd ask yourself and Dan on your reflections as well. We're obviously talking about additional pressure on Russia. whether that's economic pressure, whether that's military pressure, sanctions pressure, in the hope that somehow either Russia will crack, perhaps there will be an outburst of public opinion, perhaps Putin will crack. We've not mentioned the fact of his upcoming war crimes charges, which will make him an international pariah. And there's the premise of the sanctions policy is that the Russia will crack. How confident are we that it will be Russia that will crack first and not perhaps Western opinion? Because just as Russia is facing increasing pressure, over the next weeks, we're going to be seeing huge pressure coming from the migrant inflows, not just into Poland, but into perhaps the rest of Europe. The impact of sanctions in terms of perhaps either retributive actions by Russia, rising energy prices, inflation, increasing economic pressures. And don't forget, we are democracies. We have things called elections. We have things called public opinion. We have interest groups. We have business interests. How confident are we, President Ilves, that we, the West, won't start to fracture, that there won't be, predictably, those first siren voices of doubt, of perhaps the need for finding moderation, for slacking back? Can we hold out longer than the Russian people and Putin are going to be wanting to hold out?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but I take two approaches. The first one is the situation on the ground. We won't get anywhere unless we can get decisive victories on the part of the Ukrainians against the Russian army. And for that, as I mentioned in the last session, what is vitally necessary now is anti-aircraft cover, or missiles to take down fixed-winged airplanes, because Stingers are fine for Hind helicopters, but they don't work for bombers. And this is a big problem, and there are not enough planes. And that, as I suggested last time also, maybe a few tractors can pull them across the border. But in any case, what we really do need for Ukraine is serious missiles which would enable, especially in the south, where the land is flat and the Ukrainian forces are much more vulnerable around Odessa and that area, that the West must give those missiles. And when I just want to see when the Russians say, oh, your deliveries of weapons is an act of war, let's just test them on that. What are they going to do? That's one side of it. But the other side that I think is far more important, and since you talked about Fulton, I mean, there was a speech that was given, or not, Independence you talked about, but, well, Fulton's nearby. Missouri is this state. And there was a speech in Fulton which gave us the term the Iron Curtain, which was given by Winston Churchill, which basically was the beginning of the Cold War, or at least the definition of the Cold War began with his Fulton speech. But and then the Cold War ended, and since then, as I mentioned also in the last session, we've been kind of in this happy world. And I thought I'd just read a quote of the dilemma we're in, which is also from Winston Churchill, and it's 100 years old this year. Authority was dispersed, the world unshackled, the weak became the strong. The contrast between victors and vanquished tended continually to diminish. A vast fatigue dominated collective action. Through all its 5 acts, the drama has run its course. The light of history is switched off. The world stage dims, the actors shrivel, the chorus shrinks. The war of the giants has ended. The quarrels of the pygmies have begun. And what I have seen Europe engaged in for basically, since the end of the Cold War, have been quarrels of pygmies. And no one has been forced to really take a stand in Europe. This is where I think it is time for us, those of us from the part of the world that has been dismissed until the 24th of February, because Poles and Estonians and Czechs and Slovaks, we warned. We've been warning about this kind of behavior for decades. We warned, when we warned in 2008, what did we get? We got a reset. We warned about Syria, and we heard about red lines, about poison gas being used. But the poison gas was used, and we ignored the red lines. We had 2014. We didn't really get much. It actually took the shooting down of MH17 to actually get something done. And before that, you know, the voices in Western Europe, well, they'll just have to accept that Crimea is gone, forgetting that this was a complete, represented the complete destruction of the post-World War II settlement. So if we're going to get beyond the pygmy phase of people saying, oh, no, we can't really do that, and oh, you know, let's not do too much, or no, we can't really deliver them that, and no, we can't really do a no-fly zone, that can change only when those of us who understand the situation that the Ukrainians are in, those of us who know what it is like to have your compatriots taken away by death squads, as we have seen in Kherson, as we saw with the poor woman from Crimea who fled and was still taken by the Russians the other day. We know what it's like. This is the one reason why during my term, I visited Poland 18 times, and it was my #1 foreign policy priority, because Poland is the only big country in all of Europe when you say we had mass deportations, and the country understands. No one else does among the big countries. We are the ones who understand Poland. I am sick and tired of people who have no clue about the barbarity that the Red Army is capable of, who do not believe what is going on right now in Ukraine because they just don't have any experience. And oh, all those East European Russophobes who are always talking about, well, they don't know what they're talking about. It's the only way we can actually change the attitude in Europe is if we start saying something loudly and clearly and not bowing down to all of those who think that, well, there is no military solution. There can only be a diplomatic solution, as people are being carpet bombed, right? Because you're saying there can only be a diplomatic solution to the victims of the carpet bombing, not to the carpet bombers, right? So it is up to us. No one else is going to do this. The rest of them are going to sit there and worry about their diplomatic solution. I mean, I have nothing against the diplomatic solution, but these platitudes, we've been hearing these platitudes for 20 years. What have they given us? All they've given us is an invasion of Ukraine, actually 2. I don't want to applause, but I wanted to say it's up to you people. You are the ones in your 20s and early 30s who can actually make a difference, because you have that possibility. So please do it. Come on. It is up to all of us, but first and foremost to you who have the age and the time and the energy to get people's heads straight again.
Well, Dan, I'm going to give you the voice back now, because I think what President Ilves has touched on, I think is a very interesting topic that a lot of experts are thinking about right now. There's a very clear US policy on what it is doing right now in Ukraine. And the US is doing a lot. It's providing intelligence, it's providing logistics. You know, in Poland, we see the tremendous activity in the southeast, the transfer of weapons, that's clear. The president's also made it very clear, and he's made it very clear in a tweet yesterday, I think. We will defend every inch of NATO territory, but we will not go to war with Russia over Ukraine. But there's something in between, and I think what I'd like to ask you, Putin is aware of this. There's a lot more that he can do to ratchet up the pain in Ukraine. He can use chemical weapons, for example. He can actually ratchet up the pain outside Ukraine. He can possibly start using proxy forces in other parts of Europe. He may launch some sort of attempted adventure or quasi-coup in Moldova. He can meddle in Serbia. And there's a lot of other things that he can do to ramp up the pressure inside Ukraine, bringing in mercenaries or proxy troops from Syria, for example, and so on. Does the US government and this administration have a tactic or a strategy to address that gray zone where Putin will be seeking to push the envelope out? How can the US act to put a lid on that short of going to war with Russia? Does they have a strategy in that additional gray zone of potential Putinite meddling?
That is the right question, or one of the right questions. First of all, to what Tom Ilves said, not all of us, Tom, were blind to the growing danger. And as I said, thank God we brought in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe to NATO when we did, when we had the chance. But the challenge of dealing with Putin's Russia over the medium and longer term is going to be a profound one. Now, the Biden administration, let me unpack this, because Marek's question is a good one. The Biden administration didn't want to deal with Putin as a major challenge. They wanted to park the relationship in the place they called stable and predictable. That failed. The China first people in the administration thought that China is the more profound challenge, so park Russia and deal with China. A lot of those people are realistic about the failure of their assumptions. They understand that Putin is going to be not the more powerful tyrannical aggressor, but perhaps the more dangerous and virulent one. China likes to expand by absorbing, Russia likes to expand by destroying, and it is destruction we have to face. So what you talked about, Marek, is going to be the challenge of a longer-term policy of, dare I say it, containing Putin's Russia, containing Putin's Russia while avoiding a general war, but also while continuing to support the Ukrainian resistance. That is going to be something different than Cold War policy, where after a few years of Soviet domination, there were no armed resistance in the Soviet Empire in Europe. Soviet power was overthrown by civil resistance in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, most of all in Poland, because of solidarity. In the case of Ukraine, we are likely to see both civil and military resistance. There is a question that I addressed earlier of whether the United States will actually do more to support a free Ukraine or a West Ukraine after some settlement that may leave Putin in the hands of other Ukrainian territories. So that's one question. And the other question is, what will we do to push back on Russian adventurism and aggression through Serbia, one of the few countries, I think perhaps the only country where there have been pro-Russian demonstrations in support of Putin's war against Ukraine. So there's Serbia, there's Republika Srpska, the Balkans generally, as an area of potential Russian aggression. There is Moldova, which is exposed. I'm glad that Vice President Harris went there, but they are exposed, let's face it. And then there is the question of putting together a US policy and a transatlantic policy toward a long twilight struggle. I use the Cold War phrase deliberately. A long twilight struggle with Putin's Russia. That struggle must also involve reaching out to Russian society. There is, of course, the problem that many Russians will rally around the flag or follow Putin's extreme nationalist ideology. Many other Russians will not. And although many Russians have left, you can imagine that over time, as the consequences of Putin's aggression come home, that resistance in Russia and opposition in Russia may rise. We need to reach out to them under vastly more difficult conditions than those we faced only a month ago. We found a way during the Cold War. I suppose we can find a way using different 21st century techniques under different circumstances. Does the Biden administration have such a strategy, you asked? Not elaborated. Frankly, the people at senior levels have been running flat out dealing with the emergencies of the moment. But their thinking has embraced and started to embrace the longer term challenge. And I think you will get a policy which seeks to contain Putin's aggression, weaken Putin's economy by prolonged and enforced sanctions, and go on a strategic offensive by reaching out to the Russian people. I do not believe and have never believed that the Russian people are incapable of producing better political leadership than Putin. They have in the past. And it may be then when the costs of this war come home, that Russians will react with deep shame and wonder what kind of a leader they have that has brought them to this point of isolation. Little comfort to the people of Ukraine, I realize. So the Biden administration will have several problems. One is the immediate issue of support for Ukraine. Another is the diplomatic challenges if there is serious diplomacy, supporting Ukrainian resistance and the free Ukraine that will remain, I suspect, after the end of the acute phase of hostilities. But NATO will never go back again to a place where Article 5 guarantees were in principle only. This will remain a permanent standing challenge. US troops will remain in the Baltic states and Poland and Romania, I am convinced, for the foreseeable future. We will need to contend with Russian cyber attacks, Russian sabotage, maybe Russian assassinations of people on our territories. The long twilight struggle, and by the way, it may resemble the early Cold War, the more dangerous Cold War of near-war clashes, Berlin, Cuba. This will be a difficult time. Putin has the dictator's advantage of being able to hit where and as he chooses. We have the democracy's advantage of greater resilience if we remember it. I will say this in response to Tom's remark about pygmies. Europe had a generation of peace and prosperity, and before that, 2 generations of relative peace during the Cold War, provided by the United States. We took over a position of leadership in Europe because 2 world wars were sufficient. Americans didn't want Europeans making a mess of it again. Now we need to urge Europe to stand up. And frankly, I hope Poland is able to play a leadership role in Europe as we enter this new difficult phase. Poland is, as Tom Ilva said, the large country in Europe that gets it. It is not paranoid about Russia or Russophobic. It is accurate. And we will need the Polish-US alliance to help crystallize a common strategy around the hard truths we have just been learning.
Dan, great comments. Just with the permission of the organizers, this is such a fascinating discussion. Technically, we've run out of time, but with the permission of the organizers, I'd like to keep this discussion going for another 5-10 minutes, because there's so many important points that Dan raised. I know President Ilves wants to respond. There's one other issue I want to bring up at the end. So President Ilves, please do give us your response to Dan.
I just want to say to Dan, but in general, and to the audience, that actually when I talked about the pygmies, I did not mean the United States, which is the one country that has actually gotten things together. I'm talking about the visionaires. I'm talking about, oh no, you know, we're so dependent upon gas, we really can't do anything. I mean, I'm talking about, oh, you people, you know, why do we don't, let's not really deal with Ukraine, or Ukrainians, they're not really ready to be in Europe, and, you know, I mean, all of that, that's the pygmy stuff. And that's what gets me annoyed. And the lack of creative thinking. I mean, with this, I mean, we kind of like, I don't know, kind of squeezed through this Versailles meeting the other day. But I mean, if you're going to be sticking to exactly what the Article 49 or whatever it is in the European Treaty is about whether or not Ukraine can or cannot start negotiations when Ukrainians are being butchered, that is pygmy thinking. That's my point. I mean, we need to go beyond this. I mean, the European Union does not realize that when you're facing genocidal annihilation by a dictator hell-bent on accomplishing that, that to stick to Article 49 is moral depravity, to my mind.
Well, this is, again, thank you, President. On the final note, Timothy Garton-Ash gave a very good presentation earlier on in the day, and he talked about that we're entering a new post-war reality. And it's not a happy reality, because on the one hand, yes, we have a Europe and a transatlantic alliance that almost overnight seems to have rediscovered its mojo, its values. We're united as never before around the key principles around which Western civilization was built and which NATO was established to defend. So a reinvigorated transatlantic alliance, yes. Even a European Union, which has now come together as never before, with one or two exceptions, but really united much more than around core principles and perhaps a new dynamic towards closer cooperation within the EU. An eastern flank of NATO, which has taken the lead in defense expenditure. We're going to be seeing US troops. We're going to have more security than ever before, understood as a US presence on the eastern flank of NATO. But there's a flip side to that. There's a dark side to that. There's a new trajectory for whatever is east of the Bug River. It is a Europe or a Russia, which is autarkic, cut off completely from the world. It is not a return to 1989 Warsaw Pact versus NATO division. It's a return to 1952 Stalinist autarky. A Russia which is, if it's not already there, it will very well soon be back into its totalitarian mode of governance. And it's a Russia which will be forced into a much closer, perhaps even vassalized relationship with China. A new civilizational direction. The hopes that were expressed in that room in Independence, Missouri, 23 years ago of a Europe whole and free, that dream seems to have literally ruptured in the middle of Europe. Is this the fate? Is this really the new history that these young people in this room will be living in? of a divided world on completely different civilizational trajectories? Is there still hope for that being overcome, and what role can the Ukrainian conflict play in that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and if we would be 18 days ago, I would say that the path which we currently explained is a path which we are supposed to go, probably, because the polarization was visible, and clearly we would go years and years in increasing this polarization around two supernations, and clearly there would be escalation, as we discussed. There would be clearly one day would be similar to the Cuban crisis, where would be very high temperature already between the two largest countries. But 17 days ago, situation changed. And what's changed? The speed of time completely, I don't know how to say it, changed the direction, because we are in the situation when Ukrainian people who are staying in Bucha or Irpin or in Kyiv or Mariupol, for them every hour goes like a year. And for Europe now, if you look at, just think about 17 days ago or 18 days ago, Germany was still pushing for Nord Stream 2. And 8 days ago, Germany completely reversed its defense and foreign policy, substantially increasing the budget for the military, going for reversing 80 years strategy. So what I'm saying is the time completely changed now, and in August last year, I was giving a lecture at Yale, and we were discussing the world in 2040. And I was saying that the world is not so unified in future. There could be different worlds. Somebody will live in the Orwell 1984 with surveillance of the state or technological companies. Someone will live in the concept of post-apocalyptic, Mad Max concept, when you have the castles with people staying on, guarding the cities against those who are not vaccinated or not educated. Well, in the castles, there will be prosperity. But I said also there is a scenario, and by the way, this scenario is number one in the list of the UK intelligence service by 2040, that world does not exist because of some unfortunate developments, including the nuclear war. And that time, everybody said, okay, and since I'm speaking to 20 years old students, okay, in 2040, we will be still younger than you. So, I mean, you tell us now what was going on. So, I think the situation now, since the time completely changed its speed, and maybe if I can summarize also what the president said, it's a call to you. I was saying today in my morning speech about the mission which Poland has, which Ukraine has, and I think also you as young, bright students, one of the brightest students probably in the world, because LSE is one of the leading schools in the world, this is your mission now, to prevent or to make happen that the world will exist. And we need to do everything possible, either with diplomacy if possible, or with supporting Ukraine, because Ukraine currently is fighting for the world to exist. Because the war we have currently, let's be frank, there is already Third World War on the streets, because high energy prices lead, affecting all the world. Limiting the Ukrainian export of grain affects Middle East, Indonesia, Egypt, and there might be the cases when there will be a hunger, there will be the food security issues, energy security issues. This is already affecting many countries in the world. It's not only Russian-Ukrainian conflict. So I think your role as a young people, don't think that if you are 20, 22 years old, 23 years old, that you are still too young. You have smart minds, Use them today already. Don't wait 20 years when you will go to work or to take the heads of departments of the different agencies. You have already a voice today, you have your heads today, you have your brains today. In this world, you may make an impact, and this was the topic of today's conference. You may make an impact, and I call you to do it.
Well, thank you, Vladislav. And I can only say, in conclusion to this wonderful panel, your theme, which you have ended, is the theme of hope. And I think for all the young people in this room, they should recognize that even the love of liberty that rests within the human heart it cannot be extinguished, and it arises and it opens up in the most difficult of circumstances. We first, even in the depths of the communist tyranny in Eastern Europe, in 1953, we saw the first flutters of freedom in Berlin. Then we saw the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. Then we saw the flag of freedom flying again in Wenceslas Square in 1968. And we saw it proudly unfurled in the Gdańsk shipyard in 1980. Today it is the flag of freedom, and the moral conscience of Europe flies proudly in Kiev. We salute you, and that is the ultimate proof that the human desire for freedom can never be extinguished. And we long for the day, perhaps, sometime in the future, that the flag of freedom will also fly over the Kremlin. But your victory, which is sure, will be a grand step to that future, and will ensure that vision that dark vision which I described of a polarization of Europe, that division will be overcome in the name of freedom. Our hearts and our thoughts are with you, Vladislav. Thank you for being here. Thank you, President Ilves. Thank you, Dan, for your contribution. And thank you to the organizer for this magnificent event, which I think when we go home tonight, we will carry with us very deeply and as we go into our everyday work. Thank you again, and thank you to the panel.